back, everybody. This is Acts Part 1, Lesson 2, and the first video in that lesson. And so we see here that the believers were gathered together. They were doing what Jesus had told them to do. Remember, we saw in the first part of Acts, we saw over in Luke that he said, I want you to go to Jerusalem. You tarry in Jerusalem until you are endued with power from on high. So that's what they're doing. They're tarrying, but they're not just hanging out. They're praying continually. And then it says this, that suddenly, like a might, like a power, like a rushing wind. There's this mighty rushing wind that moved through. It wasn't necessarily a wind, but it was like a wind. We see that it's from heaven, and it filled the whole house. Now we know what day this is on. It's on the day of Pentecost. I suspect that the disciples had already probably anticipated something happening on this day in light of what they'd seen at this point in time. So this sound comes through. A lot of times people want to view it as like a gigantic wind blowing everything around. Not necessarily, but it was like, sounded like that wind. It was from heaven. Then tongues as of fire distributing themselves is what the ESV says. The idea behind this in the Greek is that these tongues were breaking off of a major thing. Okay, so it's not like one big tongue breaking into other little tongues, but fire came down and then it started distributing itself over each one of them. Okay, over each individual that was in that room, and it rested upon each believer, and it baptized them with the Spirit. It filled them with the Spirit. And this gave them utterances from the Spirit. The Spirit was speaking through them. And when you see about the Holy Spirit, Jesus taught a lot about that. You see a lot about it in the New Testament. God the Father gave the Spirit to the Son, who then sends the Spirit to believers. In this case right here, it's simply speaking of the fact that it gave speech. The Spirit gave speech to each one. What they spoke was a language that they did not know. We sometimes refer to it as tongues. It is an unknown language, okay? Something they did not know. But the ones who heard them, some of them did know what they were saying. So we know this came from God. Jesus said that it would happen. And even the prophets, many of the prophets prophesied of this. When they started speaking, the Jews that were from all over the nations heard them. Now, there were Jews that were gathered there for the feast, know that. But I like what you see in Acts, a little nuance right here. It said Jews from all over the nations who lived in Jerusalem. These were likely Jews that had been scattered in the diaspora. Various things that happened when the Assyrians in the 721 BC hauled off the northern kingdom. When the Babylonians came and conquered by 586, the conquering was done of the southern kingdom. There were still Jewish people that were left in these lands. Well, now it's literally hundreds and hundreds of years later. They had moved back, but they had a different language. So, but for some reason they moved back. I think God was moving upon their heart. They heard the noise, so a crowd gathered together. Well, what noise did they hear? They might have heard the noise like a mighty rushing wind that was filled the whole house. They definitely heard everybody speaking. It's interesting because they all started speaking, but to whom were they speaking? The 120 that were in the upper room. They're sitting there speaking and speaking and speaking. Well, they go outside, the crowd gathers, they hear people speaking in their own language, and they're amazed. The crowd is bewildered because they're hearing their native language, and they're looking and saying, these are Galileans. How in the world do they know how to talk like this? Galileans were known for their accent, like us righteous people that live in the South, right? You're known for your accent. So anyway, they were amazed. Well, here's what they were speaking. They were speaking the mighty acts of God. The crowd, again, perplexed, amazed, wondering what this was all about. Others, though, were saying, they're drunk. They're full of sweet wine. That's what the enemy will do all the time. When something moves of God, they'll come along, the enemy will come along and will immediately start questioning and saying derogatory things like that. We'll pick up right there because what happens next is Peter stands up to explain that drunk phrase they were saying, and then he winds up bringing forth the gospel message. Thanks for pressing on. I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.